Oh, it looks like we're live. So that leaves it for me to say hello and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It is, in fact, the Saturday streaming edition. And in the music world, or at least elements of the music world, the big story this week, or maybe it was last week, who knows, is this story that Van Halen is coming out with a posthumous album. Of course, Eddie tragically died in the year 2020, but Alex has said that they basically had finished all of the instrumental tracks for what would have been their next album, and so. The bass parts are all there from Wolfgang. Eddie's guitar is there. Alex's drums are all there. And it's really just a matter of two things: putting it all together, I guess making, probably doing a final mix, choosing which takes, maybe editing a few things here and there, etc. And the person who's going to do that is the producer, and I guess engineer is Steve Lukather, another one of the great musicians of all time. Most of you will know him from Toto, and he was a very close friend of Eddie. Now, Steve has made it clear, or Luke as we call him, that he's not going to play a note of guitar on this album. And I think most people are happy with that. Not because he's not a great guitar player, he is, but on a Van Halen album, everyone sort of has the expectation that all of the parts will be played by Eddie and Eddie alone. So this raises some broader questions about music, which come up in many different contexts throughout sort of every genre of music. And it's something that's been with us since before the day of recorded music, but it's probably been amplified, if you'll pardon the pun, since recorded music gives us a chance to revisit things that have been recorded in the past, but not released when the past was the present. If that makes any sense, which I do hope it doesn't. And so, in general, I don't like posthumous releases of music because I think in an artist's lifetime, the artist has an imperative. This is what I want to create. This is what I want to put out. And this is the finished product according to me. Now, that's how it should be. And that's how it often is. But of course, there are many instances where people like publishers and record companies and lawyers and agents and other people who are not composers and performers of music tend to intervene and sometimes manipulate the final product that the audience hears, that the consumer hears, beyond the scope of what the artist wants. One famous example of this, just slightly before the age of recorded sound, is one of my very favorite composers, the great Anton Bruckner. Now, Bruckner was a very interesting guy. He was very shy, had a lot of self doubt. In his early years, Wagner was very supportive of helping him to break into the mainstream orchestral music scene in Vienna, one that was very hostile to a man like Bruckner because of his religiosity, because of his sort of rural and humble background. But Wagner, who was the superstar of the world at that time in orchestral and operatic music, to be more specific, he helped Bruckner break in, and he became one of the great symphonists of all time. Now, here's where the posthumous question comes into it. Now, in his lifetime, because of the self doubt and because he relied on consultations with a lot of people, not in terms of his composing, but in terms of putting out the final product, all of his great symphonies were edited by various maestros in his lifetime. And so when you see the various editions of a Bruckner symphony, you'll see the name of very famous conductors who had edited the final piece, the final manuscript, so that the version at the premiere and the versions that were played throughout Bruckner's lifetime were somewhat different than the version that Bruckner on his own desk composed through his pen. And again, some people argue over how big the differences are between Bruckner's personal versions and the premiere versions, but they are different. And in terms of which ones are better, that's a subjective argument that's probably going to go on so long as people like me love Anton Bruckner. Now, here's where it kind of gets funny. Decades after Bruckner's death, beginning in the 1930s, a man called Robert Haas began to go into the Bruckner archives and make sure that the versions that were printed for public performance were the so-called original versions, the versions that Bruckner himself in his own hand had written out during the composition process, as opposed to the official versions up until that time, which had these edits and changes that were made mainly by the maestros, the conductors who premiered the pieces. And so by the time Haas gets done with these, what he called, I believe, the definitive versions, there was an argument about, well, which do we perform? And every conductor sort of had a different point of view. And even beyond and before Haas, there were conductors who performed versions that were somewhat different than the original premiere versions. Furtwängler, for example, had some of his own takes on Bruckner's symphonies, as did Mengelberg. But unlike Mengelberg, Furtwängler recorded them so we can hear his versions. Then others, like Hans Knappertsbusch, continued to both record and perform the premiere versions, the versions played in Bruckner's lifetime, right up until his death in the 1960s. And so when it comes to Bruckner, you have a lot of options. And then even towards the second half of the 20th century, a man called, I believe it was another Robert, but Novak came around and said, well, yeah, Haas's versions are original, but mine are even more original. He claimed that the versions that he compiled were even more authentic to that which Bruckner wrote in his own hand than Haas. So now you kind of have three versions plus. You have the versions of Bruckner that were premiered in his lifetime. You have the stuff that Haas came out with in the 30s, which claimed to be the most authentic Bruckner symphonies, the most authentic scores. And then you have in this from the second half of the 20th century, you have the Novak editions, which claim to be even more authentic than the Haas. And so this sort of gets into, well, what really is authentic? And the question is, it's sort of all authentic because in Bruckner's lifetime, the edits that were made by these maestros weren't done behind his back. They weren't done for commercial purposes per se. They weren't done to spite him. They were done at his request. He wanted these conductors to look at his scores and say, right, do what you need to do to make them ready for the premiere. And yet, the stuff that he wrote by hand and said, right, that's me done, and you can sort of see that either in Haas or in Novak, depending on whose, methodologies you prefer. You could say those are original and authentic too. The difference and where some of the irony and some of the confusion and nuance and all of these stupid things come into it is, well, in Bruckner in his lifetime, well, we knew what he felt because he was saying stuff, as most people who aren't deaf, dumb, and blind tend to do when they're alive. Much harder when you're dead. Case in point, we don't know what Bruckner thought about Haas and Novak because he was dead when they did their thing. And so to this day, there are entire websites, and indeed, there's a nonprofit group called, I believe it's a nonprofit group called the Bruckner Society. Well, not much profit to be made in that industry anyway. And what they do is a lot of these people catalog all of the different versions when they were performed, when they were recorded, and they frequently have debates over which one is better than the other. And it can be interesting and all of that type of good stuff. And so that's one example, but there are many others. Frank Zappa, for instance, it often happens to someone who dies young and who's prolific. So Frank Zappa obviously died comparatively young, and he was incredibly prolific. And when he died, there was a lot of stuff on tape that had never been released. Subsequent to his death, and almost right up to the present day, the Zappa family estate released loads of music from those Frank Zappa archives. And I'm not all that thrilled about it. And I'll tell you why. In Frank Zappa's lifetime, he was incredibly meticulous about what he released. Everything that he released, and especially the stuff he released once he famously sued Warner to break free from that, it was all Frank Zappa. The playing was Frank Zappa. The overdubs, which were done for very specific reasons, that was Frank Zappa. The edits, the mixing, the mastering, the cover art, the formats. I need something's binging and bonging in the background. The formats on which they were released, the media on which they were recorded, analog versus digital, for example. These were all decisions made meticulously by Frank Zappa. He talked about these in interviews, he wrote about them in the liner notes. And it's just, for me, it's a bit uncomfortable to have anyone who isn't Frank Zappa release Zappa music, because he was someone where the final product was Frank, top to bottom. There are some musicians who, even in an age where musicians from the 70s onward tended to be more hands-on in the mixing process, in the editing process, and all the rest of it, there are some who are completely fine, go into the studio, play the song, hand it over to the producer and the record company and whoever else, and let them do with it what they will. You used to see this a lot in the classical industry. Classical musicians tended to care very little about recording when it first came out. So someone sticks a microphone in front of their orchestra or their chamber group, they do what they need to do, and they leave. But of course, and this ironically also tended to happen in the 70s, people like Herbert von Karajan, very, very hands-on in how it was recorded, how it was edited, how it was mixed, how it was mastered, the format on which it was played back on. Herbert von Karajan, very instrumental in the creation and the promotion of the compact disc, for instance. And so when you the more hands-on a musician is in his or her lifetime, the more I go eek when people try to make posthumous decisions, which are impossible, because unless someone wrote very detailed notes, it's difficult to tell. Then there's the case of posthumous Queen. The final technical sort of studio album from Queen was Made in Heaven, and that was done with vocal tracks that Freddie had recorded in his lifetime, but the musical backing tracks were incomplete. It's my understanding that Freddie actually wanted the band to finish the record, and so they did. But if they were to go beyond that very specific request with completed songs, I don't know if I'd really be into that. And again, I'm not saying that people can't do it. People have, or at least they should have, the ultimate, absolute, and unrestricted right to free speech and expression. They can do what they want. I'm just saying what I personally find tasteful or distasteful, what I personally like or what I personally aren't so much of a fan of. And then there's sort of things that are sort of hyper high tech. And one example of this was when Natalie Cole, a very good singer who's sadly gone as well, her father died at a young age, she did a fake, if you will, duet with her father, Nat King Cole, singing the song Unforgettable through multi track technology, or by then it would have probably been digital multi track. I think this was in the early 90s or very late 80s when she did this. She did a duet with her father where one line of the song was sung from her father's recording from the 50s, and the next line was sung by her, who recorded it, I think it was in the early 90s. And that's sort of intentionally inauthentic in the sense that you're using multi-track recording technology and other editing devices, whether in the analog or digital realm, to have a living person simulate a real life duet with someone who's long past. And again, that I find okay because it's not trying to hide the fact that it's something inauthentic, in the sense that it's not a collaboration that's done in real time. I mean, you could also argue that that overdubs themselves, multi-track recording, creates a sense of inauthenticity, because before that, every musician who appeared on a recording needed to be in the same room recording at the same time. Multi-track allows you, on the same song, mind you, to record the drums and the bass on Monday, the guitar and the keyboards on Tuesday, the lead vocal on Wednesday, and the sort of maracas and backing vocals and all that fun stuff on a Thursday, because who doesn't like shaking their maracas on a Thursday? And so is that authentic? Well, if we're talking about posthumous stuff, it's authentic in the sense that everyone is alive at the same time and agreeing to the same things in the same space and time. Ooh, spooky. But is it authentic in the sense of a spontaneous musical experience that everyone shares? People over the years have had different points of view on that. So let's bring it back to what Alex Van Halen is doing. So what one of the reasons I respect the Van Halen brothers a lot is they never wanted to milk the cash cow by putting out crap. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of the sort of bonus material that you find on the super hyper mega ultra deluxe releases of certain bands, it's really stuff that I'm not interested in, and I don't think a lot of people are interested in. We're not really interested in hearing the sound of a drummer to tune his drum heads, or a guitarist plugging the guitar into the amp. Most people, some, it's a niche. Some people like that stuff. Most people find it boring. Most people want to hear a finished product where the band, the musicians, whoever it is, sounds as good as they possibly can. And this is totally consistent with traditions of live performance that long predate the recorded industry. Why do bands rehearse in private and then perform in public? Well, you want to get the bad stuff out of the way, the boring crap out of the way, before the paying, eager audience sits in the chair. The whole goal of a live performance in front of an audience is you want it to be better than the rehearsal. If not, you would just have the rehearsal and the concert be the same thing, and you could call it improvisation. I jest. Or Jester Max, is it? I don't know. But the whole point of music isn't that perfection is attainable. Nothing in at that created by the hand of man can be perfect. But what is attainable and in fact desirable is for a musician to put out the best product that they can to the audience that's willing, able, and wanting to hear it. And so I really respect the Van Halen brothers for not inflicting, 100 tracks of warm-ups and discarded music and edits nobody ever wanted to see the light of day. And this was very much true in their lifetime. Van Halen albums were short and sweet. There was no filler. And to me, that shows a respect for the audience. They don't want to bore the audience. They don't want to waste the audience's time. So total respect for that. And that's why Alex and even Eddie in his lifetime was somewhat hesitant to put stuff out that wasn't really for the album. And they even said, look, when we record our albums, we generally record them, certainly in the early days, very quickly. We don't do exhaustive amounts of takes. We'll do a few takes and they're all similar, and the best one goes on the record. Again, that's how it should be done. And so, given that background of the Van Halen brothers and what they've stood for all their lives, I'm much more willing to want to accept what Alex is doing than I would be if someone else were doing it. Because, first of all, these are not outtakes, these are not sort of scraps of ideas. These are, according to Alex, fully fledged, finished songs recorded in their final perfect state by the three instrumentalists in the band. What is missing, and this is kind of funny, is the vocals. So let's recap where we are here. Not outtakes, not edits, not useless piles of junk. These are real songs that were, well, they're not songs yet until the vocals are on. We'll get to that in a minute. These are real pieces of music, real compositions played by the band in a final state. And the only reason that they weren't released is things weren't totally complete before Eddie died. Now, what was that? The final mix probably wasn't complete. Various edits weren't complete. Smoothing various things over with equalization, EQ, probably wasn't complete. And the most sort of staggering thing, if you will, that was incomplete, no vocals. And that's kind of interesting in and of itself, because the Van Halen brothers have had two, I know technically three, but they've had two lead vocalists, and the brothers have famously had their ups and downs, primarily downs, with both of them. Now, at this point in time, it doesn't look like Alex is talking much to either Sammy Hagar or David Lee Roth. And so what he said is that we're sort of looking for a singer, not to join a band that's going to go out on the road. It seems pretty clear that a Van Halen without Eddie cannot go on the road, where this album obviously has Eddie on it because he recorded these tracks not long before he died. And so the question is, well, who should be the singer? And the question from there is, well, is that authentic? Well, bands in their lifetime change lead singers. Some make a habit of it. Van Halen is one of those bands. So the fact that there's no sort of strict loyalty to the lead singer is in fact in keeping with the authentic traditions of Van Halen. Now, is it authentic for one of the members, the most important member of the band, to be dead? And have a singer, well, in most, a singer that he didn't approve of because he can't. Well, in most cases, I would say that is inauthentic. But in this case, because Alex and Eddie are brothers who did everything together and made all of the decisions together, sure, they butted heads a bit, but the final decision is always the brothers versus the rest of the band versus the rest of the world. So, yeah, I think whoever Alex picks is authentic. And Alex had an interesting statement to make. He wants to get a singer that's roughly his age. That's the generation of him and Eddie, so that they bring to the album a similar mindset and similar sort of lived experiences that Eddie and Alex bring to the album, which is ironic because the bass player on the album, and who had been the bass player of Van Halen since 2007, is from a younger generation because it's Eddie's son, Wolfgang. But that's a story for another day. So it will be interesting to see who they pick. And it will be interesting to see if this is accepted as an authentic piece of Van Halen or a kind of novelty. Because a lot of these posthumous albums that I was talking about earlier, posthumous compositions, posthumous whatever, things released outside of the scope of the artist's ability to approve them or oversee them because the guy is dead. A lot of these things strike me as inauthentic, but sometimes you can do it right. It looks to me, for the various reasons I outlined, that Alex is in fact doing it right. But will the general public agree? That is a big question, and I guess we'll only learn the answer whenever this thing is released, and we don't really know when that will be. So let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.